A guy named Caleb had been in someone's life for 3 years. 3 years of picking up the slack, showing up early, staying late, absorbing her chaos like it was his job. He never once asked for anything, never complained, never drew a line. He was the human equivalent of a safety net, always there, never acknowledged. And one Tuesday afternoon, completely without drama, he just stopped, deleted the thread, rescheduled his own life, not out of spite, not to prove a point. He stopped because somewhere between his third cancelled weekend and his fourth, "you're the only one who gets me" conversation, a quiet realization had settled in. He had spent 3 years auditioning for a role that was never going to be offered. That moment, that specific invisible turning point, is happening across the world right now, and it's reshaping how a generation of men chooses to spend their time, their energy, and their emotional investment. This is Psyche Shift. We unpack the real mechanics behind human behavior, not buzzwords, not trending takes. The actual psychological roots of why people move through the world the way they do. What we're examining today isn't about men becoming worse. It's about men becoming honest with themselves for the first time, and why that shift is being mislabeled, misunderstood, and consistently misread by nearly everyone watching it happen. Before we can talk about what's changing, we need to understand what was there to begin with. Most of what we call nice guy behavior has almost nothing to do with being nice. Genuine kindness is something a person chooses from a place of security. What we're actually describing is a behavioral script, one that gets written into a lot of boys before they have the cognitive tools to question it. Picture the early environment for many of these men. Expressing frustration gets labelled as a temper. Needing reassurance gets called clingy. Wanting to talk about something emotionally real gets met with discomfort or silence. The feedback loop teaches a specific lesson. Your emotional authenticity is a problem. Make yourself smaller, be useful, agree, accommodate, and the people around you will stay. That's not character development. That's a coping architecture. Attachment researchers have documented this pattern extensively. It falls under what's often described as anxious avoidant adaptation, where individuals suppress their genuine needs to maintain closeness with others. The child who learns that expressing a need risks losing connection will find indirect ways to stay connected. Helpfulness, agreeableness, constant availability, conflict avoidance at almost any cost. Fast forward 2 or 3 decades, and that same child is now a grown man who genuinely can't tell the difference between wanting to help someone and needing to help someone in order to feel safe. The behavior looks identical from the outside. The internal experience is completely different. One comes from abundance. The other comes from fear, wearing generosity as a disguise. Zoom in on your own patterns for a moment. When you volunteer for something inconvenient, when you absorb someone's frustration without pushing back, when you rearrange your priorities the instant someone else expresses a need, are you doing those things because you genuinely want to? Or because some wired-in part of you believes that saying no is the same as inviting abandonment? That distinction is where the whole conversation actually begins. Not with grand declarations about changing your life, just with that one honest question asked quietly, in the middle of your next, "Of course I don't mind." Now here's the layer that rarely gets examined. A significant portion of men operating in this pattern aren't giving freely. They're operating on a one-sided agreement, one they drafted in their own head, never shared with anyone, and expect the universe to honour on their behalf. The psychological term for this is covert contractualism. The structure goes roughly like this. I will do generous, supportive, self-sacrificing things, and in exchange, I will eventually be chosen, valued, seen, or loved in the way I privately need. Nobody signs this contract. Nobody reads it. Nobody even knows it exists. But the man writing it keeps a meticulous internal ledger of every entry, every contribution, every favour extended without reciprocation. And when the ledger goes unsettled for too long, the resentment that emerges genuinely surprises the people around him, because from their vantage point he was always willing. He never said otherwise. Let's make this concrete. A guy named Warren had been in a close friendship with someone named Lena for about 18 months. He'd helped her move, sat with her through a health scare, consistently prioritized her needs over his own schedule. In his mind, this was a relationship being carefully built towards something deeper. In her mind, he was a close friend, who she appreciated and trusted. Same relationship, two completely different internal narratives. When Lena started spending most of her time with someone new, Warren withdrew, hurt, confused, and carrying a quiet bitterness he couldn't fully explain. From the outside, it looked like jealousy. From the inside, it felt like betrayal. But the betrayal was of an agreement he'd created entirely on his own. The painful truth here isn't about Warren being a bad person. It's that he never actually showed Lena who he was. She never got to decide if she wanted what he actually wanted, because he never told her. He performed patience and generosity while privately accumulating expectations, and then blamed the relationship for failing terms it had never agreed to. Real reciprocity requires you to actually say the words. It requires you to be someone with desires, preferences, and limits, not someone who manufactures an atmosphere of selflessness and waits for the other person to intuitively respond. The move here is something therapists call stated reciprocity. Before you extend yourself significantly, check in with yourself. Would I be genuinely okay if this returned nothing? If the honest answer is no, then either say something or choose differently. That's not cold, that's just clean. Relationships built on stated truth are more durable than ones built on silent sacrifice and mounting frustration. Pay close attention to this next part, because this is where most conversations about this topic go sideways. When men begin stepping back from this pattern, when they stop the reflexive yes, start protecting their time, begin expressing actual preferences, the word that tends to emerge both from others and from their own internal critic is selfish. But selfish, by its actual psychological definition, means pursuing your own interests in ways that actively harm or exploit others. That's the real thing. What gets mislabeled as selfishness here is something categorically different. It's self-differentiation, the capacity to maintain a stable, authentic sense of self within close relationships, rather than dissolving into the emotional weather of whoever is nearby. Developmental psychology has studied this extensively. Differentiated individuals, people who can hold their own perspective, express their own needs, and say no without needing to construct an elaborate justification, consistently demonstrate healthier attachment patterns, more sustainable relationships, and greater emotional resilience, not in spite of their autonomy, directly because of it. Flip this around from the other person's perspective for a moment. Would you genuinely trust someone who never disagreed with you, who had no discernible preferences of their own, who seemed to reshape themselves around your mood like a mirror? You might find that convenient, you might even lean on it, but trust, deep respect, real attraction sustained over time, almost never. Because trust is only meaningful when you know the person could push back but is choosing not to. A yes from someone who never says no is worth nothing. When men start having actual opinions, maintaining actual commitments to themselves, and being honest even when it creates friction, they aren't disappearing. They're arriving, a lot of them, for the first time. The practical application: begin in low-pressure moments. Voice a genuine preference when someone asks where to eat. Stick with your plans when a last-minute request comes in and you've already made a decision. These aren't dramatic acts of rebellion. They're small acts of self-definition that compound, over time, into a recognizable sense of self that other people can actually orient toward. Pull back from the individual for a second, because this isn't just a story about personal psychology. There's a structural change happening in how information moves through culture, and it's accelerating this shift in ways worth understanding. A decade ago, concepts like anxious attachment, emotional labor, people-pleasing dynamics, and covert resentment patterns were largely confined to therapy rooms and academic texts. Access to that language required either personal experience in therapy or enough privilege and time to seek it out deliberately. That's no longer the case. These frameworks are now part of everyday conversation, discussed in podcasts, broken down in long-form videos, referenced casually by people who have never set foot in a therapist's office. A man who grew up with no vocabulary for what was happening inside him can now, at 28 or 35 or 45, encounter a concept that names the experience he's been living for decades. And once something gets named, it becomes visible. Once it's visible, it becomes a choice rather than a default. This is the engine behind what's being called the nice guy extinction. It's not that men are becoming harder or more guarded, it's that a large number of men are for the first time looking at their own behavioural patterns and recognising that they chose none of it consciously. It was handed to them by family dynamics, cultural conditioning, and environments that rewarded emotional self-suppression. Now, worth being precise about what this shift doesn't mean. The loudest corners of online male self-improvement culture have taken this legitimate psychological awakening and distorted it into something else. A performance of invulnerability, hyper-independence dressed up as strength, emotional unavailability reframed as standards. That's just the original problem wearing a different costume. It's still a performance, it's still a mask, it just feels more aggressive. The men who are actually navigating this well aren't building walls, they're building foundations. A guy named Dario put it this way in conversation with a close friend. I used to think having no needs made me low maintenance. Now I realise it just made me invisible. That's the actual shift, from invisibility to presence, from performed ease to genuine ground. Get specific about the territory here, because there's a significant difference between what this shift involves and how it gets portrayed. What genuinely changes when a man moves out of this pattern, the automatic, reflexive yes that bypasses any actual internal checking, the tendency to apologise preemptively before anything has even gone wrong just to manage the atmosphere, the habit of reading every room and adjusting himself to be the least inconvenient presence in it, the practice of tolerating dynamics that actively cost him, in time, in energy, in self-respect, because the alternative feels too risky, the belief, buried but active, that he has to earn his place rather than occupy it. What doesn't shift, and this matters more than people realise, is the capacity for genuine care, real warmth, the desire to invest in people who matter. None of that disappears. In most cases, it actually becomes more authentic. Because care that comes from a place of security lands differently than care that comes from a place of fear. One feels like a gift, the other eventually starts to feel like pressure. A relationship therapist named Dr. Alexandra Solomon describes this distinction clearly in her work on relational self-awareness. The goal isn't to care less, it's to care from a more honest place. To stop offering things you resent giving, to stop showing up as a curated version of yourself designed to minimize friction. Come back to Caleb from the beginning of this video, after he stepped back, after he stopped being the permanent safety net. Something happened that he genuinely didn't anticipate. The person he'd been orbiting around noticed, asked what had changed, and for the first time in 3 years, he actually told her. Not as a punishment, not to create guilt. Just honestly, from a quiet place. I've been showing up at the cost of my own life, and I haven't felt like that actually registers for you. That's been hard. That one conversation, uncomfortable, direct, self-respecting, did more to create genuine closeness than 3 years of silent presence ever had. Because she was finally meeting him, not the performance, not the availability, him. The nice guy isn't fading because men are becoming less interested in connection. He's fading because the psychological overhead of that particular performance has become impossible to sustain quietly. The information is too available now. The language is too accessible. The pattern is too recognizable once you've seen it once. And that's not a crisis. It's a course correction. The world doesn't need fewer warm, emotionally present men. It needs more men whose warmth comes from a stable place. Men who help because they genuinely want to, who say no when they mean it, who bring an actual self into their relationships rather than an elaborate act of emotional accommodation. That version of selfish, the one that simply means knowing your own value clearly enough to stop negotiating against yourself, is worth becoming. Not because it makes you harder to reach, because it makes you real to reach. And real connection, the kind that actually sustains people, was never available to the performance anyway. It was only ever available to the person underneath it. Sit with that for a minute. If you recognized yourself in any part of this, in the invisible agreement, in the reflexive accommodation, in the quiet resentment that's been building underneath a surface that looks perfectly agreeable, that recognition is the most useful thing you'll take from this video, not a strategy, not a framework, just the clarity of actually seeing the pattern for what it is. Awareness doesn't fix everything immediately, but you can't find your way out of a room you haven't admitted you're trapped in.